I took the job because I was desperate. That's the truth, and I won't pretend otherwise. The sign in the window said, "Help wanted, night shift, good pay." I'd been driving for hours, the desert stretching out in every direction, the sun a molten coin sinking behind the distant mountains. My car's gas gauge hovered just above empty, and my wallet was even lighter. I pulled into the station on instinct, more out of hope than expectation. The place looked like it had been built in the 1960s and never updated. Two battered pumps, a flickering neon sign that read, "Open 24 hours," and a squat building with sun-bleached windows. The desert wind rattled the metal awning, carrying with it the scent of dust and something older, something I couldn't quite name. I parked beside the pumps and killed the engine. The silence was immediate and total, broken only by the ticking of my cooling engine and the distant cry of a coyote. I stepped out, stretching my legs, and walked toward the door. The glass was so dusty I could barely see inside, but a bell chimed as I pushed it open. The interior was dim, lit by a single overhead bulb and the red glow of a soda machine in the corner. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with canned goods, motor oil, and faded postcards. Behind the counter sat an old man, his skin tanned and creased like worn leather, eyes sharp and watchful beneath a battered baseball cap. He looked up as I entered, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before he spoke. "You here for the job?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I saw the sign." He grunted, as if that was answer enough, and gestured to the stool across from him. "Sit." I did as I was told, feeling the weight of his stare. Up close, I could see the lines etched deep into his face, the way his hands trembled slightly as he reached beneath the counter. He pulled out a sheet of paper, yellowed and creased, and slid it across to me. "Read these," he said. "If you can follow them, you'll make it through the night." I picked up the paper. The handwriting was neat but old-fashioned, each rule numbered and underlined. Rules for the night shift, desert gas, and go. Never leave the station lights off after midnight. Don't sell gas to anyone who arrives on foot. If the payphone rings, do not answer it. Keep the front door locked between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m. If you see headlights on the old service road, turn off the radio and wait behind the counter. Never, under any circumstances, go into the storage room after 1:30 a.m. If a customer pays with coins older than 1960, give them what they want and don't ask questions. If you hear knocking from under the floor, ignore it. At sunrise, unlock the back door and sweep the threshold with salt. I read the list twice, my brow furrowing deeper with each line. "Is this some kind of joke?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The old man shook his head. "No joke. You want the job, you follow the rules. Simple as that." I looked at him, searching for a hint of a smile, a glint of mischief. There was none, just tired eyes and a kind of grim patience. "Why?" I asked. "Why these rules?" He shrugged. "Been here a long time. Seen a lot of things. The rules keep you safe. Break them, and you won't last till morning." I glanced at the clock on the wall. 6:47 p.m. The sun was almost gone, the sky outside turning the color of bruised peaches. I thought about my empty wallet, my car running on fumes, the long road behind me, and the longer one ahead. "All right," I said, folding the paper and tucking it into my pocket. "I'll do it." The old man nodded, as if he'd expected nothing less. He stood, moving with a stiffness that spoke of old injuries, and handed me a set of keys. "Front door, back door, storage room. Don't lose them." He walked me through the basics. How to work the register, where to find the cleaning supplies, how to reset the pumps if they jammed. The instructions were straightforward, but his eyes kept drifting to the clock, as if he was counting down the minutes. At 7:30, he handed me a battered flashlight and a small bag of salt. "You'll need these," he said. "Trust me." I nodded, feeling the weight of the keys and the rules in my pocket. The old man paused at the door, looking back at me one last time. "Remember," he said, voice low and serious. "No matter what you see or hear, stick to the rules. Don't try to be a hero." With that, he stepped out into the dusk, his silhouette swallowed by the desert shadows. I watched him go, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling air. I was alone. The silence pressed in, thick and heavy. I walked the aisles, checking the shelves, trying to memorize the layout. The station was small, but every corner seemed to hold a secret. The storage room door was painted a dull red, the handle cold beneath my fingers. I resisted the urge to open it, remembering Rule 6. I settled behind the counter, the register humming quietly, the clock ticking louder than it should. I pulled out the list of rules and read them again, tracing each line with my finger. The first hour passed slowly. A couple of cars pulled in, travelers on their way to somewhere else. I sold gas, chips, a pack of cigarettes. The customers were tired, polite, and gone as quickly as they came. At 9 o'clock, the desert outside was swallowed by darkness. The only light came from the neon sign and the harsh fluorescence overhead. I turned on the radio, searching for music, but all I found was static and the faint echo of distant voices that I tried not to think about the rules, but they lingered at the edge of my mind, each one a question I didn't want to answer. At 10:15, the payphone outside rang. The sound was sharp and sudden, slicing through the quiet like a knife. I froze, my hand hovering over the register. The payphone was mounted on a rusted pole just outside the front window, its receiver dangling from a frayed cord. I could see it through the glass, illuminated by the sickly yellow light of the sign. It rang again, and again. Each shrill peal seemed to echo off the empty highway, bouncing back at me from the endless dark. I remembered Rule 3. If the payphone rings, do not answer it. I stood there, heart pounding, watching the phone as if it might sprout legs and walk away. The rational part of my brain told me it was just a phone call. Maybe a wrong number, maybe a prank. But the rest of me, the part that had read the rules, the part that felt the weight of the desert pressing in, knew better. The phone rang a fourth time, then fell silent. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The silence that followed was deeper than before, as if the desert itself was waiting to see what I would do. I busied myself with small tasks, wiping down the counter, restocking the candy display, checking the pumps through the window. Anything to keep my mind off the phone, off the rules, off the growing sense of unease that crept up my spine. At 11 o'clock, a car pulled in. An old sedan, paint faded to a dull gray, headlights flickering. It rolled to a stop beside Pump 2, and a man stepped out. He was tall and thin, dressed in a suit that might have been expensive once, but now hung loose on his frame. He moved with a strange, jerky gait, as if he wasn't used to his own body. He didn't look at me as he filled his tank. When he came inside, he kept his eyes on the floor, his hands buried deep in his pockets. "Evening," I said, trying to sound casual. He didn't respond. He placed a handful of coins on the counter, quarters, dimes, nickels, all worn smooth with age. I glanced at them, then at him. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were too dark, too deep. I remembered Rule 7. If a customer pays with coins older than 1960, give them what they want and don't ask questions. I rang up his gas, handed him a receipt, and slid the coins into the register without a word. He nodded once, a stiff, unnatural motion, and left. I watched him drive away, the taillights vanishing into the night. I checked the coins before closing the drawer. 1947, 1952, 1939. My hands shook as I closed the register. The clock crept toward midnight. The station lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows across the floor. I checked the bulbs, making sure none had burned out. Rule 1. Never leave the station lights off after midnight. I made a circuit of the building, flashlight in hand, checking every corner, every door. The storage room was locked, the handle cold and unyielding. I pressed my ear to the door, listening. Nothing. I returned to the counter, the list of rules spread out before me. I read them again, committing each one to memory. The old man's words echoed in my mind. The rules keep you safe. Break them, and you won't last till morning. At 12:01, the lights flickered. Just once, a brief stutter, but enough to send a jolt of fear through me. I hurried to the breaker panel in the back, checking each switch, each wire. Everything looked normal, but the fear lingered. I returned to the front, eyes scanning the darkness outside. The desert was a black ocean, the highway a thin ribbon of nothing. I felt small, exposed, a single point of light in an endless void. At 12:30, the payphone rang again. This time, the sound was softer, almost pleading. I stared at it, willing it to stop. It rang 5 times, then fell silent. I checked the clock. 1 a.m. The hours crawled by, each minute stretching longer than the last. I fought to keep my eyes open, to stay alert. The rules were a mantra in my mind, each one a lifeline. At 1:15, I heard footsteps outside. I looked up, heart racing. A figure moved along the edge of the parking lot, just beyond the reach of the lights. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of a person, walking slowly, deliberately. They stopped at the edge of the lot, staring at the station. I waited, breath held, as they stood there, unmoving. After a minute, they turned and walked away, swallowed by the darkness. I shivered, rubbing my arms. The air inside the station felt colder, heavier. I checked the thermostat, but it read a steady 72 degrees. At 1:29, I heard a soft knocking from under the floor. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper. Then it grew louder, more insistent. Knock, knock, knock. Rule 8. If you hear knocking from under the floor, ignore it. I gripped the counter, knuckles white, and stared at the clock. The knocking continued, rhythmic and patient. I forced myself to focus on the rules, to trust that they would keep me safe. At 1:30, the knocking stopped. I let out a shaky breath, feeling sweat bead on my forehead. The silence returned, deeper than before. At 1:45, a car pulled in. A pickup truck, old but well-maintained. The driver was a woman in her 40s, hair pulled back in a tight bun. She smiled as she came inside, her eyes bright and friendly. "Quiet night?" she asked, glancing around. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just the usual." She bought a coffee and a pack of gum, paid with a crisp 20, and chatted about the weather, the road, the price of gas. Her presence was a relief, a reminder that the world outside still existed. She left, and I watched her drive away, the taillights fading into the night. At 1:59, I checked the front door, making sure it was locked. Rule 4. Keep the front door locked between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m. I double-checked the lock, tested it twice, then settled behind the counter. The minutes ticked by, slow and heavy. At 2:10, I saw headlights on the old service road. They appeared suddenly, a pair of bright beams cutting through the darkness. I remembered Rule 5. If you see headlights on the old service road, turn off the radio and wait behind the counter. I reached for the radio, fingers trembling, and switched it off. The silence was immediate, oppressive. I crouched behind the counter, heart pounding, and waited. The headlights drew closer, then stopped at the edge of the lot. I heard the engine idle, then shut off. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the lights vanished, as if swallowed by the desert. I waited 5 minutes, then 10, before standing. The lot was empty, the service road dark and silent. At 2:45, the payphone rang again. This time, the sound was different. Not just a ring, but a faint, static-laced voice on the other end, as if the phone itself was trying to speak through the glass. I stared at it, my hands pressed flat against the counter, refusing to move. The urge to answer was almost physical, a pressure in my chest, a whisper in my ear. I gritted my teeth and looked away, focusing on the humming of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, anything but the phone. It rang 7 times, then stopped. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat. I wiped my palms on my jeans and tried to steady my breathing. The minutes crawled by. I checked the list of rules again, reading each one aloud in a whisper, as if saying them could make them more real, more powerful. The words felt like a shield, thin but sturdy, between me and whatever waited outside. At 2:59, I heard footsteps on the gravel outside the front door. Slow, deliberate, crunching in the silence. I peered through the window, but saw nothing, just the empty lot, the desert beyond, and the faint outline of the highway in the distance. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I held my breath, listening. A shadow passed across the frosted glass, tall and thin, moving with a strange, gliding motion. I pressed myself lower behind the counter, heart hammering in my chest. A soft, almost polite knock sounded at the door. Once, twice, 3 times. I didn't move. The rules were clear. The door stayed locked until 3 a.m. No exceptions. The knocking stopped. I waited, counting the seconds. At exactly 3 o'clock, the footsteps retreated, fading into the night. I stood slowly, legs trembling, and checked the clock. The minute hand had just ticked past the hour. I unlocked the door, as the rules allowed, and peered outside. The lot was empty, but the air felt colder, heavier, as if something had passed through and left a residue behind. I closed the door and locked it again, just in case. The next hour was the longest of my life. The station felt smaller, the shadows deeper. I kept the lights on, checking each bulb, making sure none had burned out. The radio stayed off, the payphone silent. At 3:30, I heard a low, guttural growl from the back of the building. I grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the storage room, stopping just short of the door. The growling stopped, replaced by a faint scratching sound, like claws on wood. Rule 6. Never, under any circumstances, go into the storage room after 1:30 a.m. I backed away, heart pounding, and returned to the front. The scratching continued for a few minutes, then faded into silence. At 4 o'clock, the sky outside began to lighten, the first hints of dawn painting the horizon in shades of purple and gold. I felt a surge of relief, as if the worst was over, as if the coming day could wash away the night's terrors. But the rules weren't finished with me yet. At 4:15, a man appeared at the edge of the lot. He was dressed in a faded denim jacket and jeans, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. He walked slowly, deliberately, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. He stopped at the pumps, looking up at the station. I watched him through the window, every muscle tense. He didn't move for a long time. Then, without warning, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the desert. I let out a shaky breath and checked the clock. For 30, the sky was brighter now, the darkness retreating. At 5 o'clock, the payphone rang one last time. This time, I didn't even flinch. I let it ring, counting each chime until it stopped. At 5:30, the old man returned. He pulled up in a battered pickup, dust swirling around the tires. He stepped out, moving slowly, and walked to the door. I unlocked it and let him in, relief flooding through me. He looked me over, eyes sharp and assessing. "You make it through?" I nodded, too tired to speak. He grunted, a sound that might have been approval, and walked behind the counter. He checked the register, the pumps, the lights. Satisfied, he turned to me. "Any trouble?" I hesitated, then shook my head. "Nothing I couldn't handle." He nodded, as if that was the only answer he expected. He handed me a mug of coffee, hot and bitter, and sat on the stool across from me. "You followed the rules," he said. "That's what matters." I sipped the coffee, the warmth chasing away some of the night's chill. "What happens if you don't?" He looked at me for a long moment, then shrugged. "You don't want to find out." I believed him. The sun rose, painting the desert in gold and pink. The old man stood, stretching his back, and handed me the bag of salt. "Last thing," he said, "unlock the back door and sweep the threshold with salt. Don't skip it." I did as I was told, the salt crunching under my boots as I swept it across the doorway. The air felt lighter, the station brighter. When I finished, the old man nodded. "You did good. Most don't make it through their first night." I looked at him, searching for answers. "What is this place?" He smiled, a tired, knowing smile. "Just a gas station. But the desert's old. Older than you, older than me. There are things out here that don't belong anywhere else. The rules keep them out. Or keep us in. Depends on how you look at it." I shivered, despite the growing warmth. He clapped me on the shoulder. "You want to come back tonight?" I thought about the rules, the pay, the long road ahead. I thought about the darkness, the phone, the knocking under the floor. I nodded. He smiled again, a little wider this time. "Good. I'll see you at sunset." He left, the door closing softly behind him. I stood in the empty station, the list of rules in my pocket, and watched the sun climb higher in the sky. I had survived my first night, but I knew, deep down, that the desert was just getting started. The day passed in a blur. I tried to sleep in the back room, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard the payphone ringing, the knocking from under the floor, the footsteps outside the door. I kept the list of rules on the table beside me, reading them over and over, as if repetition could make them a part of me, as if knowing them by heart would keep me safe. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with sand and shadows, with voices whispering in languages I didn't understand. I woke up sweating, heart racing, the sun already dipping low in the sky. I splashed water on my face, changed into a clean shirt, and made myself a cup of instant coffee from the battered machine in the corner. The old man arrived just before sunset, as promised. He looked at me with a kind of quiet respect, as if surviving one night had made me part of a club I never wanted to join. "Ready for round 2?" he asked, his voice rough but not unkind. I nodded, though my hands trembled as I took the keys from him. He lingered for a moment, watching me check the lights, the doors, the salt by the back threshold. "Remember," he said, "the rules aren't just for you. They're for everyone who passes through. You keep them, you keep this place safe. You break them, and the desert takes notice." He left, and I was alone again. The first hour of my second night was uneventful. A family in a minivan stopped for gas, the kids pressing their faces to the glass, wide-eyed at the old-fashioned pumps. A trucker bought coffee and a pack of jerky, nodding politely before heading back out onto the highway. For a while, it almost felt normal. But as the sun vanished and the sky turned black, the station changed. The shadows grew longer, the silence deeper. The rules felt heavier, as if the desert itself was watching, waiting for me to slip. At 9:30, the payphone rang. I ignored it, focusing on restocking the shelves, counting cans of beans and bottles of water. The phone rang again at 10:15, then at 10:45. Each time, I let it ring, refusing to even glance in its direction. At 11 o'clock, a man arrived on foot. He came from the direction of the highway, his clothes torn and dusty, his face streaked with sweat. He stumbled into the light, waving his arms, shouting for help. "Please," he called, voice hoarse. "My car broke down. I've been walking for hours. I just need some water, maybe a phone to call for help." I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to help. But the rules were clear. Don't sell gas to anyone who arrives on foot. He reached the door, pounding on the glass. "Please, man, I'm dying out here. Just let me in for a minute." I shook my head, mouthing, "I'm sorry," through the glass. He stared at me, eyes wide with disbelief, then anger. "You're just going to leave me out here?" he shouted. "What kind of person are you?" I turned away, heart pounding, and busied myself behind the counter. When I looked back, he was gone, vanished into the darkness. I tried to convince myself he was just a desperate traveler, that I hadn't left someone to die in the desert. But deep down, I knew better. The rules weren't about kindness or cruelty. They were about survival. At midnight, the lights flickered again. I rushed to the breaker panel, checking every switch, every wire. The bulbs buzzed and hummed, but stayed on. I breathed a sigh of relief and returned to the front. At 12:30, the payphone rang. This time, the sound was different, softer, almost melodic, like a lullaby played on broken strings. I pressed my hands over my ears and waited for it to stop. At 1 o'clock, the knocking started under the floor. Louder this time, more insistent. I gripped the counter, repeating the rules under my breath, refusing to move. At 1:15, the radio turned itself on. Static filled the station, followed by a voice, soft, distant, echoing. "You don't belong here," it whispered. "This place is not for you." I turned the radio off, but the voice lingered in my mind, a cold weight pressing against my thoughts. At 1:30, the scratching began at the storage room door. I backed away, remembering the rule: never go into the storage room after 1:30 a.m. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if something inside was desperate to get out. I pressed my back to the far wall, eyes fixed on the door, praying it would hold. At 2 o'clock, the front door rattled. I checked the lock, making sure it was secure. The handle twisted, then stopped. I crouched behind the counter, heart racing, as footsteps paced outside. At 2:15, the payphone rang again. I ignored it, focusing on the rules, on the clock, on the slow, steady passage of time. At 2:30, the headlights appeared on the old service road. I turned off the radio, crouched behind the counter, and waited. The lights drew closer, then stopped. I heard voices outside, low, murmuring, impossible to understand. I waited, counting the seconds, until the lights vanished and the voices faded. At 3 o'clock, the door stopped rattling. I unlocked it, as the rules allowed, and peered outside. The lot was empty, but the air felt colder, heavier. At 3:15, a woman appeared at the pumps. She was dressed in black, her face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. She moved slowly, deliberately, her hands gloved and pale. She didn't look at me as she filled her tank. When she came inside, she placed a handful of coins on the counter, old, tarnished, older than 1960. I gave her what she wanted, not asking questions, not meeting her eyes. She left without a word, her car vanishing into the night. At 4 o'clock, the sky began to lighten. The payphone rang one last time, softer than before, almost sad. At 5 o'clock, the old man returned. He looked at me, eyes tired but kind. "You did good," he said. "You're learning." I nodded, too exhausted to speak. He handed me the bag of salt. "Sweep the threshold. Don't forget." I did as I was told, the salt crunching under my boots, the air growing lighter with each sweep. The sun rose, painting the desert in gold and pink. I had survived another night, but I knew, deep down, that the desert was still watching, still waiting. The third night, I arrived early. The old man was already there, sitting on the hood of his truck, sipping coffee from a battered thermos. He watched the horizon, the last rays of sunlight bleeding out over the sand. "You're early," he said, not looking at me. I couldn't sleep. I replied, which was true. The days were restless, haunted by dreams of endless highways and empty payphones, of voices whispering from beneath the floorboards. He nodded, as if he understood. "It gets easier. Or maybe you just get used to it." I took the keys from him, feeling their weight in my palm. "Why do you stay?" I asked. He smiled, a sad, distant smile. "Someone has to. The desert doesn't care about people, but it remembers. If no one keeps the rules, things get out. Or in. Either way, it's bad for everyone." He finished his coffee, slid off the hood, and clapped me on the shoulder. "You'll do fine. Just remember, never answer the payphone." He left, his truck kicking up a cloud of dust as he disappeared down the highway. I watched him go, feeling more alone than ever. The station was quiet as I prepared for the night. I checked the lights, the locks, the salt at the back door. I walked the aisles, making sure everything was in its place. The list of rules was taped to the counter now, a constant reminder. At 8 o'clock, a couple in a battered RV stopped for gas. They were cheerful, laughing about the heat, asking for directions to the nearest motel. I gave them a map, sold them a couple of sodas, and watched as they drove away, their laughter lingering in the air. At 9 o'clock, the payphone rang. I ignored it, focusing on the register, on the hum of the refrigerator, on the steady ticking of the clock. At 10 o'clock, a group of teenagers pulled in, their car blasting music. They bought snacks and energy drinks, joking about the creepy old gas station in the middle of nowhere. I smiled, rang up their purchases, and watched as they sped off into the night. At 11 o'clock, the lights flickered. I checked the bulbs, the breaker panel, making sure everything was working. The lights steadied, but the shadows seemed deeper, the air heavier. At 11:30, the payphone rang again. This time, the sound was different, distorted, echoing, as if coming from a great distance. I pressed my hands over my ears and waited for it to stop. At midnight, the knocking started under the floor. Louder than before, more urgent. I gripped the counter, repeating the rules under my breath, refusing to move. At 12:30, the radio turned on. Static filled the station, followed by a voice, soft, distant, echoing. "You don't belong here," it whispered. "This place is not for you." I turned the radio off, but the voice lingered in my mind, a cold weight pressing against my thoughts. At 1 o'clock, the scratching began at the storage room door. I backed away, remembering the rule: never go into the storage room after 1:30 a.m. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if something inside was desperate to get out. I pressed my back to the far wall, eyes fixed on the door, praying it would hold. At 1:30, the scratching stopped. Silence settled over the station, thick and suffocating. At 2 o'clock, the front door rattled. I checked the lock, making sure it was secure. The handle twisted, then stopped. I crouched behind the counter, heart racing, as footsteps paced outside. At 2:15, the payphone rang again. I ignored it, focusing on the rules, on the clock, on the slow, steady passage of time. At 2:30, the headlights appeared on the old service road. I turned off the radio, crouched behind the counter, and waited. The lights drew closer, then stopped. I heard voices outside, low, murmuring, impossible to understand. I waited, counting the seconds, until the lights vanished and the voices faded. At 3 o'clock, the door stopped rattling. I unlocked it, as the rules allowed, and peered outside. The lot was empty, but the air felt colder, heavier. At 3:15, a woman appeared at the pumps. She was dressed in black, her face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. She moved slowly, deliberately, her hands gloved and pale. She didn't look at me as she filled her tank. When she came inside, she placed a handful of coins on the counter, old, tarnished, older than 1960. I gave her what she wanted, not asking questions, not meeting her eyes. She left without a word, her car vanishing into the night. At 4 o'clock, the sky began to lighten. The payphone rang one last time, softer than before, almost sad. At 5 o'clock, the old man returned. He looked at me, eyes tired but kind. "You did good," he said. "You're learning." I nodded, too exhausted to speak. He handed me the bag of salt. "Sweep the threshold. Don't forget." I did as I was told, the salt crunching under my boots, the air growing lighter with each sweep. The sun rose, painting the desert in gold and pink. I had survived another night, but I knew, deep down, that the desert was still watching, still waiting. The days began to blur together. I slept in fits, waking at every creak and groan of the old building, every gust of wind that rattled the windows. The desert sun was relentless, baking the sand and the station until the air shimmered with heat. I spent my afternoons in the shade, sipping lukewarm water, watching the horizon for dust devils and distant cars. The old man came and went, always at sunset, always with the same tired smile. He never asked if I wanted to quit, never offered me a way out. He just handed me the keys, the bag of salt, and the list of rules, as if passing down a family heirloom. I started to notice things I hadn't before. The way the shadows moved just a little too quickly at dusk. The way the payphone's cord seemed to grow longer each night, snaking across the concrete like a living thing. The way the storage room door sometimes rattled on its hinges, even when the wind was still. I kept the rules close, reading them every hour, tracing the faded ink with my finger. They became a mantra, a lifeline. I added my own notes in the margins, reminders, warnings, little prayers. Don't look at the payphone after midnight. Don't speak to the woman in black, even if she asks for help. Don't open the back door before sunrise, no matter how much someone begs. The nights grew stranger. Sometimes, I'd see figures standing at the edge of the lot, just beyond the reach of the lights. They never moved, never spoke, just watched. Their eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. Other times, I'd hear voices whispering from the desert, calling my name, promising safety, forgiveness, escape. I ignored them, focusing on the rules, on the steady ticking of the clock. One night, around 2:45, the payphone rang and rang, never stopping. I pressed my hands over my ears, humming to drown out the sound. When it finally stopped, I found a single coin on the counter, old, tarnished, stamped with a date I couldn't read. I swept it into the register without a word. Another night, the knocking under the floor grew so loud I thought the boards would break. I sat on the counter, feet pulled up, repeating the rules over and over until the knocking faded. The old man never asked about these things. He just looked at me, eyes full of understanding, and nodded. "You're doing fine," he'd say. "Just keep going." I wondered if he'd ever broken the rules, if he'd ever answered the payphone or opened the storage room after 1:30. I wondered what he'd seen, what he'd lost. One morning, as the sun rose, I found him waiting for me by the pumps. He looked older than usual, his shoulders slumped, his hands shaking. "Sit with me," he said, and I did. We watched the sun climb over the mountains, painting the sky in gold and pink. "This place," he said, voice soft, "it's a crossroads. Always has been. Things pass through here, some good, some bad, most just old. The rules keep the balance. They keep us safe, but they're not perfect." I listened, silent. Sometimes something slips through. Sometimes someone breaks a rule. When that happens, you do what you can. You clean up, you start over. You keep going. He looked at me, eyes tired but kind. "You're part of this now, whether you like it or not." I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to. That night, the desert was restless. The wind howled, rattling the windows, sending sand swirling across the lot. The lights flickered, the radio hissed with static, the payphone rang and rang. At 1 o'clock, a car pulled in, a sleek black sedan, windows tinted, engine purring. The driver stepped out, tall and thin, dressed in a suit that seemed to absorb the light. He walked to the door, pausing just outside. I watched him, heart pounding, as he placed a single coin on the ground, a silver dollar, gleaming in the neon glow. He looked up, meeting my eyes through the glass. His gaze was cold, empty, endless. He smiled, a thin, humorless smile, and walked back to his car. The engine roared to life, and he vanished into the night. I waited until sunrise before picking up the coin. It was warm to the touch, heavier than it should have been. I dropped it into the register, not daring to look at the date. The old man arrived at dawn, as always. He saw the coin, nodded, and said nothing. The days and nights continued, each one a test, each one a lesson. I learned to trust the rules, to trust myself. I learned that fear was a tool, not an enemy. I learned that the desert remembers. One night, just before dawn, the payphone rang one last time. I ignored it as always. When the sun rose, I found a note taped to the door. "You kept the rules. You kept the balance. Thank you." It wasn't signed, but I knew who it was from. The old man retired a week later. He handed me the keys, the bag of salt, and the list of rules, now worn and creased, covered in my own notes and scribbles. "It's yours now," he said. "Take care of it." I watched him drive away, his truck disappearing into the morning light. I stood in the empty station, the desert stretching out in every direction, the rules in my hand. I was the keeper now. The nights are still long, still strange. The payphone still rings. The knocking still comes from under the floor. The woman in black still fills her tank with coins older than memory. But I know what to do. I know how to survive. I follow the rules. And when the sun rises, I sweep the threshold with salt, and I wait for the next night. Because out here, in the endless desert, the rules are all that stand between us and the darkness. And I intend to keep them.